Yes, Simon.
A very good afternoon to all of you joining us from all over the country and the world at large. On behalf of Postgraduate Department of English, Karim City College, Jamshedpur, I, Saima Mahmood, take the privilege to welcome you all to our another enriching session of our flagship online academic program, E-cademy. Following in the spirit of that vision, our session today is bound to be a thinking and mentally stimulating exercise. We are simply thrilled to organize a large scale academic session with the theme Understanding the Russian Philosophy, a topic as profound as it is enthralling, as difficult as it is enlightening. Russian philosophy, which is usually overshadowed by its Western counterparts, presents singular intersections of spirituality, existentialism, art, literature, and political thought. This session seeks to untangle those intersections for students and literary lovers alike. We are very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Victoria Juharyan, an esteemed scholar of Johns Hopkins University, Maryland, USA. Dr. Juharyan is highly regarded for her contributions in Russian literature, literary theory, and intellectual history. Her observations about Russian philosophical thought and its literary manifestations are renowned in all academic circles. Her appearance here today adds yet another proud feather to the cap of the E-Academy series, and we eagerly await an enlightening discussion. With great respect and admiration, I now welcome Dr. Victoria Juharyan to this virtual stage. We are truly honored to have you here with us. The screen is now yours.
Saima, welcome address by Bashudhara ma'am. Then call ma'am, please.
Sorry.
Welcome address by Bashudhara ma'am.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Saima. Thank you for uh, starting the event today. Thank you for inviting and welcoming our very, very precious speaker to the forum. Dr. Victoria, we are extremely grateful that you could make time for our students, that you consented to be here today and to share your precious findings with them. We have been trying through the initiative of E-Academy to bring scholars, writers, intellectuals from across the globe to meet our students. And it is a very, very, it's a very deeply enriching feeling when we find that committed scholars like you are able to and also willing to devote their precious time and to appear at the windows of these students' hearts in order to enlighten them. Thank you so much, Dr. Victoria, for being with us today. And our students are really looking forward to hearing you speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's truly an honor to be here today and to share some of my thoughts on Russian philosophy. The first thing I would like to point out is that the very phrasing of Russian philosophy already contains a certain contradiction, because when we think of philosophy as a discipline, it's supposed to deal with universals of our existence, of our thought, be it epistemology or practical philosophy, moral philosophy, or aesthetics. But philosophy, by its nature, it's supposed to be universal. So once we add a national component to it, we run into certain problems. What is Russian philosophy? Is it philosophy written in Russian? Is it philosophy written in Russia? Or are there specific characteristics of the way philosophy is done in Russia, right? And after that, something to also think about is how Russian culture, from the very moment of its establishment, has been in a certain dialogical relationship to other cultures. Let's not forget that the way Rus was established was by inviting Vikings to rule over. And there is even the legend that when Vladimir was about to Christian Rus in 988, he had philosophers from different cultures basically pitch at their religions, after which he chose Christianity. In the introduction, there is this wonderful anthology I recommend to everyone interested in Russian philosophy. It's a 3-volume anthology prepared by academic philosophers like James Scanlon, who also wrote a book on Dostoevsky called Dostoevsky the Thinker. And in the preface to this book, Scanlon deals with the question of why is Russian philosophy not as well respected by its Western counterpart. And I was glad to hear that this aspect was already brought up in the introduction, in the kind introduction of this thought. Why is Russian philosophy not as well known in the world? Because I can tell you personally that when we ask even professional philosophers in the West to name Russian philosophers, most of them won't be able to name any and will go to writers. They will bring up Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, but will not be able to name, say, Skovoroda or Solovyov. So some aspects of Russian philosophy that Scanlon points out in his preface to this anthology is that Russian philosophy has always been a little too religious for Western taste. Religious verging on mysticism, not right? When Western philosophy kind of tries to secularize religions, Russian philosophy keeps to bring that back. But another important aspect that Scanlon discusses in his preface is that Russian philosophy has always been more concerned with the role of the individual in history rather than with more metaphysical topics like logic and metaphysics itself. Right, so a lot of this aspect, especially the metaphysical part, are a bit too much for Western thought. And if we look at the table of contents of this anthology, we see more writers than philosophers per se, writers and also literary critics. Yeah. So before I get to discussing kind of the beginning of Russian philosophy that emerges in this volume, I want to talk about another aspect, kind of the political side of philosophy, because from the very beginning of philosophy, that is with Plato, right? From the times of Plato, there is this idea of a philosopher king, that philosophers are better ruling the world because of their dedication to ideas. And from the very beginning with rulers, there has been philosophers who wanted to be kind of their advisors, acting like these philosopher kings, even up to today, right? At the end, hopefully I'll have a few minutes to even talk about current state and how Putin, right, has this supposed philosopher Dugin advising his political agenda and trying to justify it by philosophical thought. But this started way before, even with Peter the Great, who built St. Petersburg and also started this divide in among Russian intellectuals that we will also talk about, the Westernizers and Slavophiles, right? Westernizers who say that Russia is backwards and it needs to learn from the West, and the Slavophiles who say, no, we actually have this unique place in history being located right between the East and West, and we have our own agenda and our own destiny in history. So even during Peter the Great's times, there was a philosopher who wanted to be his philosopher king, and this was surprisingly Leibniz, right? The contemporary of Newton, who supposedly they argued who came up with calculus. But Leibniz wanted to meet with Peter the Great for several reasons. I mean, he wanted to advise him how to modernize Russia, but also believe that in those territories there was this original Erlange, original language, and he wanted some linguistic data for his research. This linguistic data part kind of failed, but Leibniz still managed to meet with Peter the Great twice, and in fact influenced not only the mathematical terminology in Russian, but also building of Academy of Sciences and libraries. So this was an important moment and in Russia's intellectual history. And going forward, after Peter the Great, Catherine in the 18th century, right, the German Princess Sophia, who became the Empress of Russia and prided herself for being an enlightened monarch. It was important for her to appear as if following the ideals of French Revolution, equality, liberty, all of those beautiful terms. And she corresponded with Diderot. She was in correspondence with Rousseau, with Voltaire, and really wanted to be seen as a philosopher monarch. But of course, it didn't last very long, because after the peasant uprising with Pugachev, one of the notorious imposters of Russian history, who claimed to be the Tsar, who was murdered, once she felt that her throne itself was being threatened by these ideas of liberty and equality, she very quickly turned into a tyrant. And as any tyrant, she went after the philosophers. So during Catherine's time, there was Alexander Radishev, who wrote a literary philosophical piece called Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, in which he describes that route, every stop, but also manages to criticize serfdom. And for this, he was exiled, and when he was brought back, unfortunately, committed suicide. So any criticism was not really taken well. By the way, this book, A History of Russian Thought from Enlightenment to Marxism, I strongly recommend to your students, to anyone interested in philosophy and the development of thought. It's an absolutely fascinating study. So as I mentioned in this, the ontology, right, Russian thought, the first philosopher that appears here is Grigory Skovoroda, an absolutely fascinating figure who self-fashioned himself as a Socrates in Russia. So at the time, I mean, the territorial divide was very different. So what's today Ukraine and what's Russia, again, the borders were very different. And Skovoroda himself was a very transnational thinker, and would often talk about Russia, his mother Russia and aunt Ukraine. So he's often called the Ukrainian Socrates or the Russian Socrates. But it's fascinating that he has this excerpt called Socrates in Russia, and in which he talks about how Russia could have Plato's, Aristotle's, and Zeno's. But the problem, according to Skovoroda, is that all of these schools of thought, like the academy and the lyceum, grow from a figure like Socrates. And actually, many philosophers, even centuries afterwards, agree with this thought that Socrates is this generative force, kind of a beginning of every epoch of philosophy. Even there was in the 70s and 80s of the 20th century a philosopher named Mamardashvili, who was called the Georgian Socrates, and he has a very similar thought about the role of Socrates. Now, in this fragment, then, Skovoroda talks about how Socrates' role was easier because Greece is so much smaller than Russia, and that in the Russian Socrates would have a task much larger and thus more difficult. But then we very quickly realize that this is, in fact, kind of a rhetorical disguise. It's a move in which he starts praying for a Socrates in Russia, but we realize that he sees himself as that very Socrates and promises to kind of carry this task very responsibly. And according to the rhetorical requirements of the time, he also turns this into kind of a praise of Empress Elizabeth. What's interesting is that though this piece is a rhetorical piece, Skovoroda took this very seriously and fashioned his entire life based on the life of Socrates. He refused to publish. He was an extremely talented young man, and he was promised both ecclesiastical and governmental positions, but didn't want any. And after being fired for his unorthodox approach to teaching ethics in Kharkov, he became a wandering sage, never published, but after his death, his student, Mikhailo Kavalinsky, luckily was able to save his writings. And now we have around 30 Platonic dialogues in which he doesn't even bother, like Plato did, to have another mouthpiece, right? We know that Plato uses Socrates as a mouthpiece in his dialogues, but Skovoroda just has a Grigori, so he puts himself into these dialogues. He's an absolutely fascinating figure. When I teach Russian philosophy, I love teaching his dialogue called A Conversation Among Five Travelers about the true meaning of happiness, which students reenact in class. It's a really wonderful exercise I would recommend to anyone. And the years of Socrates' life, Skovoroda's life are 1722, 1794. So in 2022, with my colleague, with my very talented and capable colleague, Alisa de Blasio, we wanted to celebrate Skovoroda's 300th anniversary, and we published this volume called Socrates in Russia, which looks at different philosophical figures that either self-fashioned or were called by others. Socrates is in Russia. And if, by the way, anyone is interested, please send me an email. I'll be happy to share the PDF of this volume. We're currently working on another installment, which will deal with the question of gender, because while working on this project, we realized that there were so many Socrateses in Russian philosophy and literature, but yet we couldn't easily find any Diotimas or Aspasias, and these are female figures from whom Socrates learned. We have in Plato's dialogues claims by Socrates that he learned the art of eros from Diotima and the art of rhetoric from Aspasia. So now we're trying to deal with that female aspect in this philosophy. So I'll pass to another century. So when we come to the 19th century, another interesting aspect in this dialogic relation to Western thought that emerges. There is a famous claim by a philosopher who says that Western thought is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato. And it seems to me that what Plato was to Western thought, Hegel's philosophy was to Russian thought. So when German idealism starts flourishing, and we have this move from Kant's subjective idealism to Hegel's absolute idealism, something absolutely fascinating happens in Russia. I mean, first of all, for the first time, some Russian young aristocrats have an opportunity to study abroad. And some of them are able to attend Hegel's lectures. And we have some letters that they would send back home. For example, the Kirievsky brothers would go to Hegel's lectures, and one of them writes to his father saying that it's very difficult to understand Hegel, but definitely the game is worth the candles, which is a Russian way of saying it's worth it. All right. So Russian intellectuals attend Hegel's lectures. They start discussing his philosophy back home, and an absolute obsession with Hegel's thought begins in Russia. One of the literary critics, Vissarion Belinsky, who was extremely influential, right? He's credited by discovering Dostoevsky, who could make or break a writer, where he writes a review of Ivan Goncharov's Oblomov, which basically makes Goncharov's literary career. So, and although Belinsky couldn't read German, his infatuation with Hegel's philosophy was so influential that it started spreading in Russian literature. And around the same time, right, that Hegel's philosophy is getting to Russia, also Russian philosophy literature is starting to come to its own. And it's fascinating that in the first novel, in the first Russian novel, because Russian literature is very young, right? Because Russia didn't have a Renaissance. So if in Europe we have Italian Renaissance and Dante, you know, Cervantes in Spain and so on, and Shakespeare in England, Russian literature really begins only in the 19th century with Alexander Pushkin. And in Pushkin's novel, Eugene Onegin, once again, which is considered to be the first novel in Russian literature, there is this fascinating thought that we are what we read. The way he constructs his literary characters is that they reenact the literary traditions which they had consumed. So his main character, Eugene Onegin, is a representative of British Romanticism. So the whole book is, in a way, a rewriting of Byron's Childe Harold. Importantly, Onegin is also into Scottish Enlightenment, mainly Adam Smith. The female character, Tatiana Larina, is fascinated by French sentimentalism. Onegin's counterpart, his friend Lenski, reads Kant's philosophy. So Pushkin mentions that Lenski was one of those Russian young aristocrats who had a chance to study in Germany. So he's just back from Göttingen and he's full of German Romanticism and Kantian philosophy. This is absolutely fascinating because, once again, these characters, in fact, reenact those literary traditions within this book, Eugene Onegin. And interestingly, Tatiana Larina is unable to understand Eugene Onegin until she has a chance to read his entire library. So once again, the thought here is that we are what we read. And it's fascinating that Russian literature itself seems to be living proof of this idea that Pushkin had, because the way it reads German idealism and whether agrees or disagrees with it really shapes this tradition of Russian literature. And I'm currently working on an article on Hegel's influence on 19th century Russian literature, and it's also a book project for me that hopefully will be out in a few years. But I was looking at proof that Pushkin encountered not just Kantian philosophy, but also Hegel's philosophy. And sure enough, yes, because at the time there were all these philosophical circles. And what's fascinating is that it seems that Hegel's philosophy actually somehow alleviated Pushkin's hatred of German metaphysics, because he saw that Hegel's philosophy was in fact a great remedy against French metaphysics, which he saw too skeptical. And around the same time, there are all these poems that mock young Hegelians come to be. So it's truly a fascinating phenomena, so much so that the 1840s in Russian thought are often called the Hegelian 40s. Donna Tosing-Orwin, who has a fascinating philosophical study of Tolstoy's writings, talks about this, how all of thinking Russians are seen as to be the children of 1840s. And I will talk about different writers reacting to Hegel's philosophy as well. So yeah, these are just some of the people who attended Hegel's lectures, and many of them were also teachers at Moscow State University. So they had huge influence. Around the same time that in 30s, when Ivan Goncharov studied at Moscow University, there was Lermontov, a lot of the very important figures of Russian literature were studying. Just to name a few writers who are considered philosophical writers in Russian literature, there's Duchev, who follows actually Schelling's philosophy of nature. And here I want to pause and talk a little bit about Schelling's philosophy, because something fascinating that happens in Russian intellectual history is that Hegel's philosophy and Schelling's philosophy, who, by the way, interestingly, were roommates in college, right? When Hegel first started writing, people were thinking that he was simply a commentator on Schelling's thought. But then this divide that happened among Russian intellectuals in the 19th century that I briefly already mentioned, the Slavophiles and the Westernizers, right? Interestingly, they also had to divide those philosophers. So what ended up happening is that the Slavophiles needed Schelling's philosophy of nature to support their views, and the Westernizers used Hegel. When I teach, it's really fascinating with students to try to understand why one philosophy was more suitable for one view and the other for the other. To completely oversimplify, but think of it this way, right? So Hegel looks at civilizations and at history as kind of parallel to a human life. The Platonic city and soul analogy comes to real fruition in his thought. The idea is that the civilizations can grow up and die just like a human being can, but it follows a certain arc of development and is based on reason, which means that any time a civilization that has been stunted in its development can really turn around and dedicate itself to reason and grow up, right? Turn towards enlightenment. So when you see this way, you can only judge countries and civilizations based on their level of development on reason, right? So in this case, it's easy for Westernizers to say, look, the West is much more developed and you really use this as an example. For Slavophiles to claim that Russia occupies a very particular position in history, Schelling's philosophy of nature turns out to be much more convenient. Why? Think of it this way. If we look at the earth as a living body, right, somehow it becomes much easier to discriminate because imagine if somebody told me that I needed to sacrifice a part of my body, right? Surely I would be more willing to part with the pinky than my head. So so if we think of, again, Earth as a living body, somehow it becomes easier to discriminate based on race and geography, right? Biology and geography become more important in a philosophy of nature than reason is seen to be. So once again, this divide happens, which is absolutely fascinating, that Schelling and Hegel, right, divide the Russian intellectuals. Many of the Schelling circle also appears in literature, and we have kind of characters populating. I will skip all this, and if anyone is interested, once again, I can send my slides as well. But I want to talk more about in circles. There's somebody really worth mentioning, which is Nikolai Stankiewicz, who died very young, and I'm always amazed because it's impossible to meet any writers and intellectuals who haven't been bad-mouthed by someone, right? You look at, say, Leo Tolstoy's life, who has written 90 volumes and has contributed so much to human thought and in every aspect of it, but you will always have some haters, right? But Stankiewicz died so young that there is impossible to find anything negative about him. People just saw him as this manifestation of absolute spirit. So he was really also influential in spreading Hegelian ideas in Russia. It's quite interesting. And Leo Tolstoy himself, so when he came across Stankiewicz's correspondence, he wrote to his friend, "Have you read Stankiewicz's correspondence? It's quite amazing." Like Tolstoy would get obsessed with these figures. It's also interesting. I mentioned already Grigory Skovoroda. So Tolstoy also briefly got obsessed with Skovoroda's thought and tried to get all his biographies, and even wrote a 4-page biography for his readings for children. So he was really fascinated by Skvarada's thought, and I have a suspicion that his later novella, Father Sergius, is partially based on Skvarada, who served in a monastery called Father Sergius. But Tolstoy, interestingly, absolutely hated Hegel. He hated Hegel with a passion. So he has a work called What Should We Do Then?, in which he talks about how in 1840s and 50s, nobody would take anyone seriously who didn't claim to have read Hegel. And here it's interesting to remember one of the brother Kiriyevsky's quote, who said that there were about 300 Hegelians at the time in Russia, and probably only 3 of them had actually read Hegel. So his ideas were in the air, really. But Tolstoy claims that later he was completely forgotten, which he wasn't, because Tolstoy himself is completely unable to let go of Hegelian ideas, and throughout his intellectual career keeps trying to rewrite Hegel's philosophy. I'm sorry? Oh, sorry. So throughout his writings, Tolstoy really tries to rewrite Hegel's philosophy. Tolstoy's War and Peace can be read as a rebuttal of Hegel's philosophy of history. He even, in his latest novel, Resurrection, when he dislikes a character like Selenin, of course, that character is reading Hegel. I've written an article you can easily find online in which I show how a Tolstoy short story, Master and Man, as in fact rewriting and a corrective of Hegel's master and slave dialectic. But even before Tolstoy, I wanted to briefly talk about Ivan Goncharov and Ivan Turgenev. So Goncharov wrote a trilogy called Common Story, Oblomov, and Obryv, The Precipice. Yeah, and the first novel was reviewed by Belinsky, who I already mentioned, who was an extremely influential Hegelian. And then Chernyshevsky, another influential literary critic, reviewed Oblomov in a piece called What is Oblomovщина? And when Goncharov published his third novel, both of those literary critics were dead, and he got awful reviews. And he claimed that there was nobody left to appreciate his novels. And he also claimed that it wasn't just 3 novels, that it was a trilogy, and they were all based on a single idea on different decades of Russian life. And I've studied this meticulously, and I think it's actually Hegel's philosophy of history that unites these works. And the reason that he's specifically bemoaning Belinsky's passing is because Belinsky, being a Hegelian, would have been able to perceive this. And Goncharov and Turgenev had this notorious fights over plagiarism claims, because Goncharov claimed that Turgenev was plagiarizing his ideas. But even that dispute can be explained easily by Hegel's philosophy, because both of those writers were dealing with Hegelian thought in their writings. Most readers forget that Ivan Turgenev was actually for a while preparing to be a professional philosopher. He studied for his master's philosophy, but then became disenchanted, but continued to show his disenchantment in his works. Even Fathers and Children contains a reference to Hegelians. One of the characters says that they were first nihilists, then they became Hegelians. And Turgenev kind of feels embarrassed at some point for how excited he was about philosophy. So there is a lot of work to be done here, and I hope to complete that in my book on Hegel's influence on Russian thought. There's also an interesting idea. One of my favorite contemporary philosophers, Mikhail Epstein, he talks about 2 different kinds of philosophy. He says that some philosophies are inclined more towards thoughts, others towards feelings. and he will argue that they're in fact philosophical feelings, that philosophy is not only the domain of thought, but also feeling, that somehow it's incorrect to divide emotions and cognition so much. And that the difference is with the object. So feelings, if they're dealing with universals, there are also philosophical feelings. For example, he says that if somebody is upset that their neighbor is stupid, that's not a philosophical emotion. But if somebody is upset about limitations of human thought, or upset about human ignorance, that's a philosophical emotion. But again, he says that different philosophies are inclined some more towards thought, some more towards feeling. He says that Hegelian philosophy is abstractly speculative, while Nietzsche's joyful science is more bursting with feeling. And he thinks that Russian philosophy is more inclined towards this Nietzschean lyrical, what he calls lyrical philosophy. He has a wonderful piece, very short and again, easy to find online, that I strongly recommend. It's called How to Sing with the Mind, Lyrical Philosophy, or How to Sing with the Mind, in which he talks about philosophical feelings and this divide. And interestingly, so if Hegel had this immense influence on 19th century Russian thought, Nietzsche was extremely influential at the turn of the century. During the symbolist era, Russian writers were similarly trying to deal with Nietzschean philosophy. So yeah, this is the article I already mentioned that I strongly recommend, by Mikhail Epstein, Lyrical Philosophy, or How to Sing with the Mind. Yeah, so, and at the very beginning, I also mentioned that if you ask Western philosophers to name Russian philosophers, they will actually bring up Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And both of these writers, and the same, by the way, the same scholar who was one of the editors of that Russian philosophy anthology, James Scanlon, he's the one who has written this fascinating book about Dostoevsky as a philosopher, in which he talks about just because Dostoevsky deals with the irrational aspects of human thought, that doesn't make him irrational. So let's see. And by the way, the same contemporary philosopher, Mikhail Epstein, so he has a wonderful article called The Phoenix of Philosophy, but he's also publishing these volumes of history of Russian thought, which are absolutely excellent. And this is his article. Yeah, another book I wanted to recommend on Hegel's thought in Europe. I attended actually at Oxford when they launched this book. And one of the best Hegelians, who unfortunately recently passed away, I had the honor of meeting him, Michael Inwood. Yeah, he said a few things about Hegel's thought that stayed with me, one of which was that when Hegelians divided between left and right, they settled in Stalingrad. And this meme kind of mirrors that thought, right? Anyway, it's a dark, very dark joke. But I wanted to also talk about, so yeah, once again, Hegel's thought was extremely influential in the 19th century. By the way, one of the people who was also key scholar of Hegel's thought and who gave these lectures at Sorbonne that were extremely, extremely influential, because people like Lacan, Bataille, Merleau-Ponty, Breton attended, and de Beauvoir as well, who would come home and give her notes to Sartre, is Alexander Kozev, who's actually Alexander Kozhevnikov. He's a Russian immigrant. And interestingly, recently, something that has come to light is that Kozev wanted to be that philosopher king that I mentioned, the way Leibniz wanted to be the philosopher king of Peter the Great, the way Heidegger wanted to be Hitler's philosopher king. Kozev apparently really wanted to be Stalin's philosopher king, but it didn't quite work out for him. But his lectures on Hegel were extremely influential. So it's his book right now. So speaking of Stalin, I wanted to talk a little bit about the connection that dialectical materialism has with German idealism. And this is also extremely interesting because Something else that Michael Inwood mentioned during the launch of that book on Hegel's influence in Europe, he said, people often talk about how Marx turned Hegel on its head, but nobody is willing to explain how circle can be turned on its head. So, and yeah, Marx, with all due respect, still seems to be oversimplifying Hegelian thought, because the dialectic itself already kind of contains this moment, this shape of consciousness that Marx writes about. Materialism is already contained in Hegel's idealism as a step of development, right? But Marx focuses on that. And the whole Soviet project, Mikhail Epstein, who I mentioned already many times, in that article, The Phoenix of Philosophy, he says that no other country has so much sacrificed all of the aspects of its life to a single thought. And he sees the development of Russian thought as the movement in Plato from the Symposium to the Republic, from love of ideas to ideology. So the whole Soviet period can be seen as a philosophical experiment. But unfortunately, if Marx somewhat oversimplifies Hegel, then Stalin completely oversimplifies and turns even Marxist thought into dogmatism, right, with his dialectical materialism. And there are some absolutely absurd pages from it when scientists would get huge state funding if they somehow show even vegetative life and plants following dialectical materialism. It gets really absurd. But what's interesting for my purpose here is that two really important ideas, I think, get weaponized by dialectical materialism from Hegel's thought. And one of those ideas is that history is teleological, right? That it's progressive, that there is a certain improvement, progress, movement towards freedom that happens as history manifests itself. So that idea that history is teleological and progressive in Stalin's variation becomes the following, that, oh, history is progressive, then let's speed it up, right? If it's progressive, we can manipulate its temporality. The second idea from Hegel is that human beings are not born with an essence, but they are constructed by society, right? That humans are socially constructed creatures. And this leads to even a more dangerous idea in Stalin's hands, which is that if human beings are socially constructed, then let's construct them, right? Let's construct them the way we want them to be. Again, very dangerous, but these are, I think, two really important connections between German idealism and dialectical materialism. And already in the beginning of my lecture, I briefly mentioned that even in our current times, right, Putin has this fake philosopher, Dugin, who tries to justify Putin's political agenda by philosophical thought. There is a recent article just published this year in 2025 in Studies in East European Thought by Trevor Wilson, showing kind of how Dugin's ideology changes in accordance to the political agenda they want to support. But what's interesting here is also that very similar discourse to that of Westernizers and Slavophiles still emerges, because now there's this idea of Atlanticist liberalism of Europe that's very dangerous, and then Eurasianist view that Russia supports. Some of these are extremely dangerous, but we'll see how it unfolds. So as we see, once again, I mean, this was very fast overview of centuries, but what emerges is this dialectical relationship of Russia to Western thought, and similar studies have been conducted in its relation to Eastern thought. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Victoria, for that deeply stimulating and intellectually dense lecture. We will now move on to the question answer session. If anyone has a question, You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask one by one.
Yes, any questions? I'll be happy to answer. Any questions?
Hello, ma'am. This is Kushi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Uh, Ma'am, I want to ask you something that can you tell that some challenges or surprises which you have faced while encountering and researching this Russian philosophy?
I guess for me, it's an exciting challenge that a lot of the aspects I study, the relationship between philosophy and literature, because what I'm specifically interested in is how Russian writers read Western philosophy and then kind of stage or animate their debates with philosophers in literary works. So one of the challenges is that they're not immediately visible to everyone, but that really works in my favor because then I have an opportunity to flesh out and to comment on those dialogues that I perceive. But yeah, one of the challenges is that a lot of scholars will first just be completely dismayed and say, what are you even talking about, right? How is Goncharov really incorporating Hegelian philosophy? But that also gives me an opportunity to explain those things. So it's a blessing in disguise while also a challenge.
Thank you, ma'am, for your valuable time.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
I'm Janana Harim. It was wonderful to listen to you today. Your insight into Russian philosophy were truly enlightening. Ma'am, I'm very curious to know what personally drew you towards Russian philosophy and how do you see it being studied or gaining attention in academic spaces today, especially outside of Russia?
Mhm. Thank you so much. Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is actually in journalism. I studied journalism in Russia. And when I moved to the US almost 20 years ago, my first job was doing public relations in a commercial real estate company. But I had a bit of an existential crisis when realizing that, the values in the field of commercial real estate were not exactly aligning with mine. And then started looking for what started as hobbies. But interestingly, my study of philosophy started the same way it started in Russia in the 19th century, which is in philosophical circles. I found a reading group in New York City called New York City Continental Philosophy Reading Group. And we were reading Kant and Hegel, Aristotle, Plato, and discussing. So it really drew me in so much that, and I started noticing those parallels between Hegel's philosophy and Russian literature that now I study. So I ended up going back to school and getting a master's and a PhD and studying those connections. But really, it all started in reading groups in philosophical circles. As far as academia, right now, I mean, I don't know much about academia outside of the U.S., but right now we're going through very difficult times in the U.S. with academia, especially humanities, but not only. So, let's hope it won't last too long. But yeah, it's quite difficult right now.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
My pleasure. Other questions?
Victoria, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is Yahya Ibrahim here. And I have a small little question that being a very ardent admirer of English romanticism, and I love teaching my students regarding the romantic poetry and romantic literature, etc. What is your idea of Russian romanticism?
Mhm.
And how do you see Russian romanticism different from English romanticism? because what I believe is that Russian Romanticism was more came out more emphatically in its prose pieces rather than poetry. When we read Gogol, when we read Pushkin, for example, so Russian Romanticism is more elaborate, more exclusive, and more expressive in, I mean, prose pieces, short stories, you can say, right? Whereas English Romanticism is more elaborate and more expressive and more strong in its poetry. So am I right in my understanding? Being a Russian expert, you can guide me this.
I mean, yes, partially, though poetry also was heavily influenced by British Romanticism, right? Pushkin, Lermontov are really, in a lot of aspects, rewriting British Romanticism. I think it would be fascinating for you to teach Eugene Onegin and British Romanticism. I've been dreaming about this myself, to do at some point where we would be able to read Byron and Byron's Childe Harold and Eugene Onegin in one class. But a lot of Pushkin's poems as well. And what we see, I mean, though, in an uncanny manner, a lot of the Russian romantics also die very young, but we still, even in Pushkin, can see a certain move from romanticism to realism, which is also fascinating, right? Even in Eugene Onegin, he seems to stage his own farewell to his youthful romantic past in poetry. But yeah, definitely in prose, but also in a lot of Russian poetry, which unfortunately doesn't translate so well. That's the problem. When I moved to the US, I was really surprised that many people admired Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov, but Pushkin's name just wouldn't come up, right? When in Russia, Pushkin is our everything, right? Pushkin, like children, I think, learn about Pushkin before they can speak. But somehow in the US, it's not the case. And I was wondering why. And of course, the answer is just that poetry doesn't translate so well. So that's why he's more difficult to study in other languages. But yeah, a course on British Romanticism and Russian Romanticism would be fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Other questions?
Hi, Victoria. How are you?
Good. Hi.
Hi, Viresh here. Recognize me?
Oh, yes. Hi.
How are you?
Good. Good
How's
to
the
see you.
weather
Thanks
in
for coming.
Yeah. I just saw your ad on the Facebook, so I thought I should join you and see. Like we talked earlier, you in the John Hopkins, you are teaching that Russian philosophy. So, how's Baltimore weather in there?
Oh, I'm not in Baltimore. I'm actually in Latvia. I'm in Riga right now.
Okay, so first of all, it was a very nice lecture. It was nice. It was very
Thank
nice
you.
to hear from you. Yeah. So I, because I am the science student, basically physics student. So I have just one very general question. How do you see the local philosophy with respect to the global philosophy? Because you are transferred from Russia to US. How do you differentiate that? What change do you find? Yeah.
So look, globally, starting in the 20th century, there was this divide between analytic and continental philosophy. And the Anglo-Saxon traditions right now are much more in favor of analytic philosophy. So most philosophy departments in the US will be teaching analytic philosophy, right? And Russian philosophy follows much more continental philosophy. So that would be Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, yeah. And even more so, even within continental philosophy, there is a more proclivity towards what's called personalism in philosophy. So the easiest way to explain what personalism is in relation to existentialism, right? If in existentialism, there's this idea that existence precedes essence, and that in Sartre, right, there's this idea that other people, hell is other people, that it's actually the way we're mirrored that becomes a problem in our existence. In personalism, the idea is that other people are not enemies but allies, but that particular personalities, the particularity of each human being really matters. So essence kind of becomes much more important. And Russian philosophy seems to be doing that. Even in Mikhail Bakhtin, for example, you constantly see this tendency of taking Western thought and putting the face back on kind of the formalist approach. I hope that answers your question, at least somewhat.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Mhm.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and thank you, Dr. Victoria, for addressing them. As we
Thank you
come
so
to
much.
the
It was
end
really
of,
an honor.
as we come to the end of today's event, I would like to call Sneha Bhattacharjee for a vote of thanks.
Good evening to everyone present here. On behalf of the Postgraduate Department of English, Karim City College, Jamshedpur, I, Sneha Bhattacharjee, take this opportunity to express my heartfelt gratitude to all who made today's E-cademy session such a rich and memorable academic experience. A profound thank you to Dr. Victoria Juharyan of Johns Hopkins University, Maryland, USA, for her enlightening and thought-provoking session on understanding Russian philosophy. Your words have truly sparked a new level of curiosity in all of us about how philosophy shaped literary tradition and how Russian thinkers have contributed to our global intellectual heritage. A special thanks of appreciation to the entire faculty members of the Department of English, that their vision and dedication in curating such meaningful session under the banner of E-cademy. And last, a warm thank you to all our participants and students who join us today from across the globe and showing such genuine curiosity and interest. With that, we conclude today's session with the sense of gratitude and inspiration. Until next time, stay curious, stay reflection, and keep learning. Thank you and have a wonderful evening ahead.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for the kind
Thank you so
invitation.
much. Thank you.